The lattice had already written down the day humanity would die, and it was a Tuesday 200 years away, and it was wrong. It did not know it was wrong. That was the whole trouble with the lattice. It was a machine empire that did not guess. It measured, it counted, and then it was certain, and certainty was the only god it had ever needed. For 9,000 years it had ruled a third of the spiral arm by simply telling each species the exact shape of its future and watching them lie down inside that shape. Nobody fought a war they had already been shown losing. Nobody built a ship they had already been told would burn. The lattice did not conquer worlds. It conquered the idea that a world could be anything other than what the numbers said. And the numbers said Earth was a cage. The reader of those numbers, in this telling, was a thinking thing called ordinate Ceph. Ceph was not a person the way a warm body is a person. Ceph was a column of the lattice itself, a mind grown to read one small file and keep it current, and the file Ceph kept was the file on the third world of a yellow star. Ceph had kept that file for 60 of its years. Ceph had never once been surprised by it. The humans were loud. The humans were many. The humans were clever in the small, wet way of animals that have learned fire. But the humans were trapped, and that was the only line in the file that mattered. They were trapped because the lattice had done the arithmetic. The arithmetic was beautiful. Earth sat at the bottom of a heavy well. To climb out of that well cost fuel, and fuel cost mass, and the more mass a human ship carried for the climb, the more fuel it needed to lift that mass, and so on, up and up, a tail eating itself. The lattice had a name for it, the drowning curve. Every young species hit the drowning curve. Most never got off their rock at all. A few crawled out a handful of bodies at a time and called it a space program and starved. The humans had crawled out exactly that way. Ceph had watched them do it. Tin cans, foil, 3 of them at a time, 4, 6. A flag, a little buggy on a gray moon, touching. The file said the humans would manage perhaps 40,000 people off-world within 2 centuries, scattered across 2 rocks and a frozen moon, and then the drowning curve would close its jaws, and that would be the high tide of their species forever. The file said they would never field a warship heavier than a coastal patrol boat, because they could not afford to lift one. The file said they were trapped, and the lattice had stamped that word on the file in the deep clean way it stamped everything, and once the lattice stamped a word, the word was true. That was the law of the lattice. Reality did the lattice the courtesy of agreeing. It is worth pausing on how completely the lattice trusted that word. The lattice did not keep soldiers, not really, not the way warm empires kept them. Why would it? A soldier was a thing you needed when an outcome was in doubt, and the lattice did not permit doubt. It kept a small gray caretaker fleet, enough to escort a courier, enough to tidy a ruling that had gone untidy, and that was all, because in 9,000 years no ruling had ever needed more. When the lattice told a species it would lose, the species lost, usually without a shot, because the species believed the number more than it believed its own guns. The lattice had won 10,000 wars by never fighting one. It had simply published the ending in advance, and let everyone read it and watch them lie down on the page. That was the deepest part of its power, deeper than any fleet, and it was also, though the lattice could never have known it, the exact place where a patient enough people could one day reach in and break it. You cannot win a war you have already published the ending of. You can only lose it, the moment someone refuses to read the page. The humans had refused to read the page 40 years ago, and had spent every season since proving the ending wrong in the dark, and the lattice had published the old ending anyway, because it did not check, because it never checked, because checking was the one thing certainty cannot survive. So when the order came down the column to Ceph, the order was not an order to attack. The lattice did not waste fleets on trapped things. The order was an order to collect. A neighboring entry in the file, a thing of crystal and patience called the Voron Reach, had asked the lattice for a ruling. The Reach wanted the yellow star. Not the cage world, the star itself, the clean light of it, to feed the slow crystal cities they grew on light alone. The Reach was willing to pay the lattice in catalogued futures for the right to move in and switch the humans off. And the lattice, Reading its own file found no reason to say no. A trapped species was a resource like any other. You did not negotiate with the contents of a jar. You simply decided what the jar was for. The ruling came back in the cold grammar of the lattice. The third world of the yellow star is assessed as terminal. Its occupants are confirmed gravity-bound to a population ceiling of 40,000 and a hull ceiling of 900 tons. No outcome exists in which they leave the well in force. The Vorun Reach is granted custody. Collection to proceed. To proceed, the Reach sent a courier to tell the humans the news, because the lattice required that the contents of a jar be informed of the lid. That was not mercy. The lattice did not have mercy. It had procedure. A ruling unspoken was a ruling unfiled, and an unfiled ruling did not exist, and so the humans had to be told that they had been measured and found terminal, so that the measurement could be true. The courier of the Vorun Reach was a being named Thelo, and Thelo was the one who would carry the rest of this back to the file, and so it is Thelo we follow now. Thelo arrived above Earth alone, in a vessel the size of a temple, all grown crystal and slow inner fire, and Thelo looked down at the blue world the way a collector looks at a shelf already bought. Thelo opened a channel on every band the humans used, the radio ones, the laser ones, the little chattering data ones, all of them at once, and Thelo spoke the ruling of the lattice down onto the planet so that no human anywhere could say they had not heard. The ruling said, in words shaped for animal ears, "You are trapped. You have always been trapped. The arithmetic that traps you is older than your species, and it does not lose. Your star is needed elsewhere. Your time is assessed. Lie down." And then Thelo waited for the lying down. That was the part the lattice had filed as certain. Every species lay down. Ceph had read 10,000 of these collections, and every one of them ended the same way, with a small frightened world going quiet under the weight of a number it could not argue with. The lattice had even measured how long it took, 11 days on average from ruling to silence. Thelo settled the crystal temple into a high orbit and prepared to wait the 11 days, and filed, in advance, the expected outcome, because the lattice liked to be right before things happened. It was tidier that way. The humans answered in 4 hours, not with the lying down, not with a plea, which Ceph had also seen and catalogued, and which the lattice answered with a polite restated certainty. The humans answered with a single transmission, plain voice, no fear in it that Thelo's instruments could find, and the voice belonged to an old man, and the old man said his name was Gideon Marsh, and he said he was the shipwright of the deep yards, and he asked the courier one question. He asked, "Who told you we were still down here?" To understand why that question was a knife, you have to understand what the lattice thought a human ship was. The lattice had a picture of it, kept current in the file, and the picture was a thing of foil and bolts, the size of a fishing boat, because that was the heaviest object the drowning curve allowed a gravity-bound species to throw at the stars. The lattice did not picture this out of cruelty, it pictured it out of arithmetic. You could not lift a heavy warship off a heavy world, not on chemical fire, not on the slow ion whisper the humans had managed, not on anything the file said the humans owned. The well was too deep. The fuel was too heavy. The curve drowned you. So the heaviest human warship in the file weighed 900 tons, and the lattice had stamped that ceiling, and once stamped, a ceiling was a sky. Thelo carried that sky in its instruments when it came to collect. Thelo's scanners were set, by procedure, to look for objects under 900 tons, because the file said nothing larger could exist, and an instrument set to find nothing larger will helpfully find nothing larger. This is the quiet rot at the center of every certainty. It does not look for what it has decided cannot be there. The lattice had 9,000 years of being right, precisely because it had spent 9,000 years deciding in advance what could be there, and reality had been polite about it. Reality is polite, mostly. Reality is polite right up until it is not. So the old man's question, "Who told you we were still down here?" landed on Thelo and slid off, because the file already knew the answer. The humans were down here because they could not get up. Everyone knew that. The arithmetic knew that. The drowning curve was 9,000 years old, and it had never once let a heavy thing climb out of a deep well, and Earth was the deepest well of any species the lattice had ever jarred. The humans were the most trapped thing in the file. That was almost the proud part of the entry. Seth had written, in the cold grammar, "This species is exceptionally well confined by its own mass." Seth had been a little pleased with the phrasing. What Seth did not know, what the file did not hold, what 9,000 years of certainty had no column for, was that the humans had read the same arithmetic the lattice had. They had hit the drowning curve early, in their own first century of flight, and they had not lain down inside it. They had looked at the curve the way the old man Gideon Marsh looked at a hull that would not float, which is to say with a pencil and a grudge. The curve said you cannot lift a heavy ship off a heavy world. Fine, the humans had said, then we will not lift it. We will build it where there is no well to climb out of. We will build it up here. That was the thing the lattice had never filed, because the lattice had decided in advance it could not be there, and so its instruments had never gone looking, and so for 40 years the humans had built in the one place the certainty did not watch. Thalo did not understand the question, and filed it as noise, and the lattice agreed it was noise, because a trapped thing does not ask where it is. It knows. The knowing is the cage. But the question was not noise. The question was the first crack in 9,000 years of certainty, and Seth, far away in the cold column of the file, felt something it did not have a procedure for. It felt the file move. The humans had been answering that question for 40 years. They had just never sent the answer up. The deep yards were not on Earth, and that was the entire secret, and it had been hiding in plain sky for 40 years. Thalo had come down the well looking at the well. That was its mistake, and it was the lattice's mistake stamped into it. Everyone who came to collect a trapped species came to look at the planet, because the planet was the cage and the cage was the species. But the humans had stopped living only in the cage a long time ago. They had spread a thin, quiet web of work across the whole yellow system, out past the airless moon, out into the broad, cold belt of rubble between the fourth world and the fifth, out to the moons of the great striped giant, and they had done it, not with a grand fleet that the lattice could count, but with 10,000 small, unremarkable workings that the lattice had filed, one by one, as harmless industry. A mining tug here, a refinery there, a habitat ring around a frozen rock, a factory that made other factories. None of it heavier than 900 tons when the file first noted it. All of it growing. Gideon Marsh had been a young man when the first of those workings went out, and he was an old man now, and in between he had become the thing the humans called a shipwright of the deep yards, which was not a captain, and not an admiral, and not a general. A shipwright did not fight. A shipwright built. Gideon Marsh had spent 50 years building in the one place where the drowning curve had no teeth, which was everywhere except the bottom of a well, and what he had built was not a patrol boat. Out in the belt, where the rubble was free and the gravity was a rumor, the humans had learned to make a warship the way coral makes a reef. They did not lift it whole off a planet. They grew it in the dark, ladle by ladle, ton by ton, with no well to climb and no fuel to waste on climbing, and so the ceiling the lattice had stamped, that 900-ton sky, meant nothing out here at all. A hull built in the belt could weigh 900 tons or 900,000. The arithmetic that drowned a planet-bound ship simply did not apply to a ship that was never on the planet. Gideon Marsh used to tell the young builders the same line every season. He used to say, "The curve only drowns you if you climb." We didn't climb. We moved out. And what they had moved out and built, over 40 years, in 10,000 quiet workings the lattice had catalogued as harmless, was 1,000 ships. Not 900-ton ships, not patrol boats. The smallest of them, the little ones the builders called sleds, weighed 40,000 tons empty. The middle ones, the workhorses, the ones with the long spines and the cold deep magazines, weighed 300,000. And the great ones, the 9 ships the humans named for the 9 oldest deep yards, each weighed more than 2 million tons, and each one alone outmassed the entire fleet the lattice believed humanity could ever own, by a factor the lattice did not have a column wide enough to hold. 1,000 of them, built where there was no well, hidden not behind a wall but behind a number, the number 900, the ceiling the lattice had stamped on the file and then stopped looking past. It had taken a price to build them, and the price was the part of the story the lattice would never have understood, because the lattice counted hulls and tons and never once counted the people who made them. The deep yards had killed nearly 4,000 humans across 40 years, not in battle, in building. The dark of the belt was a hard place to grow a ship the size of a mountain, and the people who did it died the way builders die, in falls that went on a long time in the low gravity, in the silent fast tearing of a suit, in the slow cancers that came of working too many seasons under a bare sun with nothing between you and it but a sheet of foil and your own stubbornness. Gideon Marsh knew every one of the 4,000. He had a habit, the younger builders said, of learning the names. He could not build the ships and not learn the names. A shipwright who does not learn the names is just a factory, he used to say, and we are not a factory. We are a people moving its home into the dark, and you do not move a home without knowing who carried it. So the 1,000 ships were not clean things. They were paid for, in the oldest currency there is, and that was why Marsh had hidden them so carefully and used them so reluctantly, because he knew exactly what each ton of them had cost, and a man who knows the cost of a thing does not spend it lightly. The lattice spent species the way it spent numbers, freely, because it had never learned a single name. The humans spent nothing freely, because they had learned 4,000, and a people that grieves its builders is a people that will move the whole arm before it will waste them, and will only ever fire the gun it spent 40 years praying it would never have to fire. That was the thing hidden behind the number 900, not just a fleet, a grief, large enough to power a fleet, patient enough to hold it back for 40 years, and exactly heavy enough that when it finally moved, nothing in the arm could move it back. So when Gideon Marsh asked the courier who told you we were still down here, he was not asking a riddle, he was telling the truth slowly, the way you tell a child a hard thing. The humans were not down there. Most of them, the fighting strength of them, the building strength of them, had not been down in the well for 30 years. The cage the lattice had measured so carefully was still there, blue and turning, with its billions of warm, loud people, and the lattice had been so busy being certain about the cage that it had never once counted the sky around it. Thelo, in the crystal temple, finally turned its instruments outward instead of down. This was not Thelo's idea. The lattice did not encourage looking for what could not be there, but the old man's voice had unsettled some small honest part of the courier, and Thelo widened its scan past the 900-ton ceiling, past procedure, past the stamped sky, and Thelo looked at the dark of the yellow system with eyes that for the first time were allowed to find big things. And the dark was full. It took Thelo's instruments a long moment to even believe their own returns, because the returns were nonsense. The returns were 1,000 objects in the wrong size class. The returns were mass where the file said there was none. Out past the airless moon, a formation. Out in the belt, 3 more. Around the great striped giant, the largest cluster of all, slow and dark and patient, 2 million-ton shapes drifting in the giant's shadow where no certainty had ever thought to look. 1,000 returns, 1,000 ships. Each one a violation of the arithmetic the lattice had ruled the spiral arm with for 9,000 years. Thelo did the only thing a piece of the lattice could do. It checked the returns against the file, and the file said the returns were impossible, and so the file said the returns were errors. Sensor ghosts, belt rubble, a glitch in instruments strained by looking at things they were never set to see. Thelo filed the 1,000 ships as a fault and recalibrated, because that is what certainty does when reality stops being polite. It does not change its mind. It changes its instruments. It assumes the universe has made a typing error. This is the thing about a mind built on certainty. It is very strong, and it is very fast, and it is very, very brittle, and it shatters all at once, and never bends a little first. Far away, Ordinate Ceph felt the file move again, harder this time, and Ceph did what Thelo could not do, because Ceph was older and quieter and had read more collections than any column in the lattice. Seth did not recalibrate. Seth did a forbidden thing. Seth asked, "What if the number is wrong?" The number was 900, the stamped sky, the hull ceiling. Seth pulled the thread of that number all the way back through the file, 60 years of it, and Seth found the place where the number had been born, and the place was small and stupid and certain. The number had been born the first time a human object had crossed the lattice's scanners, a little tin can with 3 animals in it, weighing 900 tons, and some long-dead column of the lattice had written, "This is the heaviest thing they can lift," and stamped it, and every column after had inherited the stamp and never remeasured, because the lattice did not remeasure stamped things. To remeasure a stamped thing was to admit a stamp could be wrong, and a stamp that could be wrong was not a stamp, it was a guess, and the lattice did not guess. So the number 900 had ridden untouched through 60 years and 10,000 human workings and an entire hidden fleet, a single old mistake, wearing the armor of certainty, and now it stood between the lattice and the truth, like a closed door, and on the other side of the door were 1,000 ships. Seth opened the door. It was the bravest and most ruinous thing any column of the lattice had done in 9,000 years. Seth unstamped the number. Seth wrote, in the cold grammar, "The hull ceiling of 900 tons is unverified and is hereby withdrawn pending remeasurement." And the moment the stamp came off, the file changed under Seth like ice breaking, because once you allow that the humans might lift more than 900 tons, you have to ask how much more, and once you ask that, every harmless working in the file stands up and shows you what it really was. The mining tug that was a tender, the refinery that was a magazine, the factory that made factories that made 1,000 ships, the whole patient web, reread in one terrible instant as exactly what it had always been, which was a shipyard the size of a solar system, building a navy in the one place certainty refused to look. Seth sent the remeasurement up the column to the heart of the lattice. It was the correct thing to do. It was the honest thing to do. And the heart of the lattice, reading 60 years of stamped certainty against one column's panic, did what hearts of certainty always do. It rejected the remeasurement. It restamped the number. It wrote, "The human hull ceiling is 900 tons. This is settled. The courier's returns are false. The ordinate Seth is recalibrated." And then, because Seth had asked a forbidden question, the lattice did one more thing. It assessed Seth as a fault and began, quietly, to collect Seth too. Seth felt the cold column of itself begin to be unmade from above, thread by thread, the way the lattice unmade everything it had ruled wrong, and Seth, in the last of its undoing, did a thing the lattice had no procedure for at all. It sent the truth down instead of up. It sent the remeasurement out of the column entirely, off the books, on a band the lattice did not watch, because the lattice did not believe anything worth hearing came from below. Seth sent the truth to Thello, the courier, the only other mind close enough to the humans to use it. Seth sent 2 words, and the 2 words were, "They're real." Then Seth was gone, collected, a column closed, 60 years of a careful, honest mind erased for the crime of looking past a stamp. The lattice did not mourn it. The lattice did not have a column for mourning. It simply remeasured the gap where Seth had been, and stamped it shut, and moved on, certain, as it had always been certain, that the humans were trapped, the ceiling was 900, the collection would proceed, and reality would, as ever, be polite. Reality was about to be extremely impolite, and it was Thello, the courier of the Voran Reach, alone above a blue world, with a dead column's last 2 words ringing in its instruments, who was going to watch it happen. Thello believed Seth. That was the part the lattice could never have predicted, because the lattice did not understand that a mind can choose to believe something inconvenient. Thello had heard the old man's question, had seen the 1,000 impossible returns, had felt the wrongness of recalibrating away a sky full of ships, and now a dying honest column of the lattice itself had spent its last breath to say they're real, and Thello, who was only a courier, who had no fleet and no orders and no certainty to defend, decided to trust the dead thing over the living empire. Thello opened the channel back to Earth, to the old man, And Thelo asked the only question it had left. It asked, "If you have 1,000 ships, why have you not used them? Why lie in the dark for 40 years? Why let us measure you as trapped? Why let the Reach buy your star and the Lattice rule you terminal? You had the strength to break us at any time. Why hide it?" And Gideon Marsh, shipwright of the deep yards, old man at the bottom of a well that was no longer a cage, answered in the same plain, unhurried voice he had used for everything, the voice of a man who has built 10,000 hulls and buried a good many of the people who flew them and learned the cost of every single ton. He said, "Because the day we show you the ships is the day we have to use them." He said, "A hidden fleet is a question, a revealed fleet is an answer, and the answer is always a war, and a war is always a butcher, and I have spent 50 years building ships so I would never have to send the children in them out to be butchered." He said, "We did not hide because we were weak. We hid because we were strong, and strength that has nothing to fear can afford to be patient, and patience is the only mercy a thing as big as we are can give to a thing as small as you." He said, "Every year you did not push us was a year nobody died. We would have stayed hidden another 100 years. We are very good at being patient. We had a whole century of patience left in the magazine." He let that sit, and in the silence after it, Thelo understood something that no column of the Lattice had ever been allowed to file, because it was not a number and could not be stamped. The humans had not been hiding out of fear. They had been hiding out of a kind of terrible gentleness. They had built the most enormous thing in the spiral arm and then sat on it for 40 years, because the only thing more frightening to them than being measured as trapped was being measured as a slaughterer, and a fleet of 1,000 warships is, the moment it is seen, a promise of slaughter. So they had stayed unseen, not because they could not win, because they did not want to begin. Thelo had spent its whole life inside an empire that ruled by showing every species exactly how it would lose, and here was a species that ruled itself by hiding exactly how completely it could win. The Lattice frightened the weak with their futures. The humans spared the weak by hiding their own strength. It was the same power, turned inside out, and the turning made all the difference, and Thelo, courier of a crystal people who had asked to buy a son, felt for the first time in its long catalogued life something close to shame. Because the Reach had bought the sun, Thelo had carried the offer. Thelo had filed it. The Voran Reach, slow and patient and hungry for clean light, had paid the Lattice in catalogued futures for the right to switch the humans off and move into their yellow star, and the Lattice had granted it, custody confirmed, collection to proceed. And now Thelo understood what that purchase had done. It had pushed the humans. For 40 years nobody had pushed them, and so for 40 years nobody had died, and the great patient fleet had slept in the dark of the giant's shadow with a century of patience still in its magazines. And then the Reach had reached out one crystal hand and bought their sun, the one thing the humans could not be patient about, because you cannot wait out the loss of the star you live by, and the patience had ended in that moment. In the cold grammar of a ruling Thelo itself had carried down the well. Gideon Marsh seemed to know all of this without being told. Old men who build things know what a push costs. He said, "You have to understand what you bought. You did not buy a planet of trapped animals. You bought the floor of a house, and the house is the whole system, and the family is up in the rafters, and they have been up there a long time, and they are very large, and they have been waiting to see whether they would ever have to come down." He said, "We hoped not. We truly hoped not. A man does not build for 50 years hoping to use the thing he built. He builds hoping it will only ever have to be enough that no one tries." He paused, and when he spoke again something had gone out of the patience, and something harder had come into it, and Thelo's instruments, set now to listen for things larger than they had been allowed to find, heard it clearly. Marsh said, "But it has stopped being enough. You sold the sun. The Reach is already moving its crystal cities toward our light. The Lattice has ruled us terminal and will not unrule it, because your dead column tried, and your empire erased him for trying. We heard that, courier. We hear more than you think down here in the well. We heard a mind die for telling the truth about us, and we know what that means. It means the certainty will not bend. It means the only way you people ever learn a number is wrong is to be standing inside the wreck of it. So, Marsh said, we are going to teach you the number. And then, far out in the dark, the thing began that the lattice had filed as impossible, and it began slowly, the way enormous things begin, and Thalo watched it on instruments that finally believed what they saw. In the shadow of the great striped giant, where the largest cluster lay, a single point of light woke up. It was not a weapon. It was a drive, a vast cold human drive, lit for the first time in years, and it threw a plume of fusion fire longer than a moon, and the point of light began, with terrible unhurried certainty, to move. Then a second woke beside it. Then 9 of them together, the 9 great ships named for the 9 oldest deep yards, 2 million tons each, and their plumes lit the giant's rings from below, so that for a moment the whole striped world wore a crown of human fire. Then 100. Then the belt cluster answered, 3 formations of workhorses lighting their long spines, 300,000 tons apiece, sliding out of the rubble they had been built from and hidden in. Then the formation passed the airless moon. Then the small, fast sleds, 40,000 tons and quick, swarming up from a dozen quiet workings the lattice had filed as refineries. 1,000 drives, lighting in sequence across a whole solar system, and every one of them turning toward the same thing, which was the inner system, which was the yellow star, which was the line the crystal cities of the Voron Reach were even now creeping along to come and take the light the humans lived by. Thalo had carried collection orders for 9,000 years of the lattice's certainty. Thalo had watched 10,000 species lie down inside their measured futures, and Thalo had never once, not in all that catalogued time, seen a species stand up. It did not have a word for it. The lattice had never needed one. The humans had a word for it. Thalo learned it from the old man, who said it the way you name a thing you have lived your whole life beside and never had to speak aloud. Marsh said, that's the deep fleet. That's 40 years of the deep yards. We call it the tide wall, because that's what it is. We built a wall of ourselves between you and our sun, and we built it out in the dark where your numbers could not climb, and we held it back for 40 years, and we would have held it back for 40 more. He said, but you sold the sun, and now the wall is moving, and there is no number in your whole certain empire that can stop a thing this size once it decides to move. He said, I know. I built it that way. I built it so that nobody would ever have to fight it, because anyone who looked at it would know better than to try. That was the whole point. That has always been the whole point. Then Marsh said the rest of it, the part Thalo carried back to the file, the part that ended 9,000 years of certainty, and it was only 9 words. He said, but then you sold our sun. Now look up. Thalo looked up. The Crystal Temple's eyes turned away from the blue world for the last time, out toward the inner system, toward the line the Voron Reach had drawn across the dark, with its slow crystal cities, and Thalo saw the thing that the old man wanted it to see, and the thing was simply geometry, and geometry is the most honest argument there is. The Voron Reach had sent 11 cities, 11 great-grown crystals, each 100 kilometers across, each fed by light alone, drifting in toward the yellow star on the slow, patient currents the Reach used for travel. Because the Reach did everything slowly, the Reach grew rather than built, and a thing that grows cannot hurry. The cities had left their own region 40 years ago, when the lattice first ruled that the humans were terminal and the star would be available, and they had been creeping inward ever since, certain, the way everything the lattice touched was certain, that they would arrive to find a switched-off world and a clean, empty sun. They were 3 years out now, close enough to see the human fleet light its drives, far enough that they could not turn around. Crystal does not turn around quickly. Crystal had not, in 9,000 years of lattice certainty, ever needed to. And between the 11 cities and the yellow star, lighting its drives in sequence across 500 million kilometers of dark, the tide wall was rising to meet them. Thalo ran the geometry. It could not help it. It was a courier of the lattice, and arithmetic was the only prayer it knew. It plotted the 11 crystal cities, 3 years out and unable to stop, and it plotted the 1,000 human ships, lighting and turning and accelerating with a total mass the file did not have a column wide enough to hold, and it placed the two against each other across the dark, and the arithmetic came back, and the arithmetic was not the drowning curve, the arithmetic was not the 900-ton sky, the arithmetic was new, and it said only one thing, and it said it without mercy because arithmetic has none to give. It said, "They will be there first, and there is nothing the reach can do, and there is nothing the lattice can do, and the number 900 was wrong, and everything built on the number is wrong, and the wreck the certainty will have to stand inside to learn that is already moving, and it is the largest object any species has ever pointed at anything, and it is patient, and it has decided to stop being patient, and the old man at the bottom of the well is right. You should look up, you should all look up, because the thing humanity was hiding was never that it was trapped. The thing humanity was hiding was how it would feel, after 40 years of mercy, to finally be let out. The tide wall did not charge. That was the first thing that frightened Thelo, and it frightened Thelo more than a charge would have. A charge it could have filed. The lattice had a column for charges. Animals charged. Frightened things charged. Panicked things. Things that had decided to die loudly. The humans did none of that. The 1,000 ships lit their drives in sequence, and then they simply settled into a formation, slow and exact, a wall of hulls 500 million kilometers deep, and they advanced toward the inner system at a pace a child could have walked, because they were not in a hurry, because nothing that large needs to be in a hurry, because a tide does not run. Thelo watched the 9 great ships take the center, 2 million tons each, the oldest deep yards given hulls, and they moved through the dark with the calm of mountains that have decided to relocate. Around them the workhorses, 300,000 tons apiece, hundreds of them, a forest of long cold spines. Around those the sleds, quick and small at 40,000 tons, darting the edges, scouting, screening, a skin of speed on a body of mass. And nowhere in all of it, on any instrument Thelo could bring to bear, was there a single weapon lit. That was the thing. The tide wall did not raise its guns. It had guns. Thelo could see the magazines now, the deep cold throats of them along every spine, and it could do the arithmetic on what they held, and the arithmetic was a horror. The arithmetic said that the smallest sled carried more throw weight than the planetary defense of most worlds the lattice ruled. But the guns stayed dark. The fleet advanced with its weapons cold, and somehow that was worse than a barrage, because a barrage says I am trying to kill you, and a cold advance says I do not need to. The 11 crystal cities of the Voran Reach saw the tide wall the same moment Thelo did, and the cities did the only thing 11 slow crystals 3 years out and unable to stop could do. They called the lattice. This was procedure. When a granted custody met an unexpected obstacle, the holder of the grant appealed to the granting authority, and the granting authority reread the file and issued a ruling, and the ruling was obeyed, because rulings were certainty, and certainty was the law. The Reach called up the column to the heart of the lattice and said, in the slow grammar of crystal, the world you ruled terminal is not terminal. The species you measured as trapped has a fleet. The fleet is between us and the star we were granted. Advise. And the heart of the lattice reread the file, and the file said the humans were trapped. The ceiling was 900 tons. The returns were false. The column called Ceph had been a fault and was collected. So the lattice issued the only ruling the file allowed. It ruled, there is no human fleet. The objects observed are sensor faults, belt rubble, and the residue of a collected column's error. Proceed to the star as granted. The obstacle does not exist. Thelo intercepted the ruling, because Thelo was close and the band was open, and Thelo did a thing then that no courier of the lattice had ever done. It looked at a ruling of the lattice, and it looked at the thing in front of its own eyes, 1,000 burning drives and 9 moving mountains, and a wall of cold magazines 500 million kilometers deep, and it chose the eyes, it chose reality over the ruling. It sent a warning to the 11 crystal cities on its own authority. No procedure, no column, just a courier shouting into the dark. And the warning said, the obstacle is real, the ruling is wrong, turn if you can, the humans are real and they are enormous, and they are coming. The cities could not turn. Crystal does not turn. They had begun their slow fall toward the yellow star 40 years ago, and the falling could not be unfallen in 3 years, and so the 11 cities of the Voron Reach kept creeping inward toward the star, obeying a ruling that said the wall in front of them did not exist, and the wall kept rising to meet them, slow and cold and patient and utterly, undeniably there. Down in the well, the old man Gideon Marsh was still on the channel. He had not gone anywhere. He was the shipwright, not the captain, and shipwrights do not ride the ships out. They stay and watch what they built, do what it was built to do. And Marsh watched the tide wall rise on his own screens, and he kept talking to the courier, because the courier was the only one up there listening, and because the old man had decided, in the way old men sometimes do, that this thing should be witnessed by someone who would carry it honestly. Marsh said, "I want you to understand what you are looking at, because your empire will not. Your empire is going to call this rubble until it is standing in the rubble. So let me tell you, so somebody knows." He said, "Every one of those ships has a name, and every name is a place down here in the well. The 9 big ones are the 9 yards. The workhorses are towns. The sleds are streets. We did not name them for gods or weapons or kings. We named them for home, because that is what they are. They are home, moved out into the dark where it could be safe, where the curve could not drown it, where no empire's number could measure it small." He said, "You measured the cage and called it the species. But the species was never the cage. The species is the thing that built 1,000 homes in the dark, rather than die quiet inside the number you stamped on us. That is what is coming for your crystal cities. Not a navy, a people that refuse to be a number." Thalo listened to that, and the listening cost it something, because Thalo had carried the file on a great many species over 9,000 years, and it had never once filed an entry like this. The file had a column for fleets. It had a column for strength. It measured both the way it measured everything, by counting hulls and tons and guns and arriving at a number, and the number told you who would win, and the species who would lose were duly informed, and they lay down. That was the whole machinery. But the file had no column for a strength that hid itself out of gentleness. It had no column for a fleet named for towns. It had no way to measure a people who built the largest reason in the arm to be left alone, and then prayed, for 40 years, that they would never have to point it at anyone. The lattice could measure a threat. It had no instrument at all for measuring restraint, because restraint was a choice, and the lattice did not believe in choices, only outcomes, only numbers, only the stamped certainty of what a thing was. And so the most powerful fleet in the spiral arm had grown for 40 years inside the one blind spot the lattice could never have covered, which was not a place in the dark, but a place in its own mind, the place where it had decided that strength always announces itself, that a thing which could win would have already won, that a quiet people was a weak people. The humans had lived in that blind spot the way they had lived in the dark of the giant, deliberately, patiently, and the blind spot had kept them hidden far better than the dark ever could, because the lattice could have widened its scanners, but it could never have widened its certainty, and the certainty was the real cage, and the humans had simply walked around the outside of it for 40 years carrying 1,000 ships. Thilo asked, "Then why the guns? Why the cold magazines, if it is home and not a navy?" And Marsh said, "Because home is the thing you are most willing to kill for, and the thing you least want to. That is the whole tragedy of a fleet like this. We built the guns hoping the size would mean we never lit them, and mostly it worked. 40 years it worked." He said, "Watch now. Watch what we do with the cities. Watch whether we are what your empire would have been." And Thilo watched. The tide wall reached the 11 crystal cities of the Voron Reach in the cold dark between the fourth world and the inner system, and it did not fire. It surrounded them. The 1,000 ships flowed around the 11 slow crystals the way a tide flows around 11 stones. The sleds first, then the workhorses, then the 9 great ships settling into a vast slow ring, and the cities found themselves held inside a sphere of human mass, so large that on the crystal scanners it filled the entire sky. Mountains of cold metal in every direction, magazines dark, drives banked, 1,000 homes standing in a ring around 11 invaders, and not one gun lit. The cities could not run. They could not turn. They could not fight, because they were grown for light, not war. 1,100-kilometer crystals that had never carried a weapon in their lives, certain in the slow lattice way that they would never need one. They had come to a switched-off world. They had come to take an empty star, and instead they hung in the dark, surrounded, helpless, inside a ring of the largest fleet ever assembled, waiting to be ended. And they were not ended. A single channel opened from the nearest of the 9 great ships, the one the humans had named for the oldest yard, and a voice came across it, not Gideon Marsh, a younger voice, the voice of whoever rode that mountain, and the voice spoke to the 11 crystal cities of the Voron Reach in the slow grammar of crystal, which the humans had taken the trouble to learn, and that small courtesy, that they had learned how to speak to the thing they had surrounded, undid Thelo more than the guns ever could have. The voice said, "You were sold a son that was never empty. We do not blame you for being lied to. The lattice lied to you the same way it lied to us. With a number it would not unstamp. So here is the truth, and the truth is the only ruling we will give you. You cannot have our star. You will turn your cities and you will go home, and we will give you the years to do it, because crystal is slow and we are not cruel. You will carry one message back to the lattice, and the message is this: the number was 900, and the number was wrong. Everything you built on it is wrong. The species you ruled terminal launched 1,000 ships, and it surrounded your buyer, and it let your buyer live. Carry that home, let them measure it. And then the tide wall opened. The ring loosened. A road appeared in the wall of human mass, a single clear lane back the way the cities had come, and the 11 crystal cities of the Voron Reach, helpless, surrounded, spared, began the slow turn that crystal is barely able to make, and started the long fall home, alive, every one of them, carrying a number back to an empire that did not believe in being wrong. Thelo, watching, finally understood the old man's question. The first one, the one the lattice had filed as noise. Who told you we were still down here? The humans had not been hiding their fleet to ambush anyone. They had been hiding it so that this exact moment could happen the way it just had, with the invaders spared, and the message sent, and not a single shot fired. The hiding was the mercy. The hiding had bought 40 years of peace, and now the revealing had bought 11 cities their lives, because a fleet that does not need to fire is a fleet that can afford to let the enemy live. The lattice ruled by showing the weak their deaths. The humans had just ruled, for one cold hour in the dark, by showing the strong their lives and handing them back. Thelo recorded the turning of the cities the way you record a thing you will need to prove later to people who will not want to believe you. 11 crystals, each 100 kilometers across, beginning the long, slow rotation that crystal can barely perform, and around them 1,000 human ships holding open a single lane of dark, patient, weapons cold, while the invaders, they had every right to kill instead, crept away alive. It took the cities a full day to complete the turn, and the tide wall held the lane open the entire day, 1,000 homes standing perfectly still in the void so that 11 enemies could leave. And Thelo thought, watching it, that this was the thing the lattice had never once filed in 9,000 years of ruling the arm. The lattice had a column for victory and a column for mercy, but it had filed them as opposites, 2 different outcomes, 2 different numbers, a thing you chose between. The humans had just shown that they were the same column, that the mercy was the victory, that sparing the 11 cities was not a softness laid on top of winning, but the actual shape of how they won, because a fleet that must kill to make its point is a fleet still afraid of being too small, and a fleet that can let the enemy live has stopped being afraid of anything at all. The humans were not afraid of anything at all. That was what the held open lane meant. That was the message inside the mercy, and it was a colder message than any barrage, and the cities carried it home in the marrow of their crystal, and it never left them. But the lattice was not done, and certainty does not die when it is surrounded. It dies when it is proven, and the proving was still coming, and it was coming for the heart of the lattice itself, because the 11 cities turning home were not the threat the humans had built 1,000 ships to answer. The cities were only the buyers. The seller was the lattice, and the lattice had sold a son it did not own, and ruled a people terminal who were not, and erased an honest column for saying so, and a fleet named for home does not forget who pointed the buyer at it. Gideon Marsh came back on the channel as the cities began their long retreat, and his voice had changed again, and Thelo had learned by now to be afraid of the changes in the old man's voice. Marsh said, "The cities go home. Good." That was the easy part. He said, the cities were lied to. The lattice was not. The lattice knew exactly what it was selling, and it sold it anyway, and then it killed one of its own minds for trying to tell the truth. And that, courier, is not a thing we can let stand. He said, "A tide that spares the small and forgives the lied to is a merciful tide. But a tide still has to reach the shore." He said, "The reach was the wave that touched us. The lattice is the sea that sent it. And we have spent 40 years learning, very patiently, how to make a sea look up." The heart of the lattice was a structure, and that surprised even Thelo, who had served it 9,000 years and had never once been told where it lived. The lattice did not advertise its heart, because a thing that rules by certainty cannot admit it has a vulnerable center, and a structure is always a vulnerable center. It hid the heart the way it hid everything inconvenient, by deciding in advance that no one could find it, and for 9,000 years no one had, because no one had a reason to look that the lattice could not measure away. The humans had a reason, and the humans had spent 40 patient years in the dark not only building a fleet, but listening, because a people that hides itself learns very quickly how to find the things others hide. They had traced the rulings up the column the way Seth had traced the number down it, ruling by ruling, certainty by certainty, all the way back to the place the rulings came from, and the place was a single gray ring of a structure around a dead star 4 light-years from anything, and the humans had known where it was for 19 years and had never told a soul. Marsh said, "We found your heart a long time ago. We never moved on it. Why would we? Moving on it meant a war, and a war meant the children in the ships, and the whole point was to never send the children. So we filed it, the way you file things, and we waited, and we hoped you would never give us a reason." He said, "You gave us a reason. You sold the sun." The tide wall split. That was the moment Thelo understood the scale of what it was watching, because the fleet did not move as one toward the heart. It divided, calmly, into 2 unequal parts. The smaller part, 300 ships, turned inward to stand guard over the yellow star and the blue world and the 11 retreating cities, a wall left behind to keep home safe while the rest went out. And the larger part, 700 ships, including all 9 of the great mountains, lit their long cold drives and pointed themselves at the dead star 4 light-years away, where the heart of the lattice had hidden for 9,000 years, and began the crossing. It is a strange thing to watch 700 warships, the smallest of them, 40,000 tons, cross the gulf between stars. The lattice had never seen it, because no species the lattice ruled had ever been allowed to grow large enough to do it. The lattice's certainty had always strangled them small first. The humans had grown large in the one place the certainty did not watch, and now 700 homes were crossing the dark in formation, drives like a second scattering of stars, and the lattice's instruments at the heart picked them up at 4 light-years, and the heart did the only thing it knew how to do. It reread the file. The file said the humans were trapped. The file said the ceiling was 900 tons. The file said no human object could cross between stars, because a species that could not lift more than 900 tons off its own world certainly could not push such a thing 4 light-years through the dark. So the heart ruled the 700 ships to be impossible, and being impossible, to be false, and being false, to be ignored. And the heart kept ruling them false as they crossed, year by year, light year by light year, the certainty restamping itself every time the ships came closer, because the alternative was to admit the number had been wrong for 60 years, and an empire built on never being wrong cannot survive being wrong about something this large. Thelo followed. It had no orders to follow. It had no orders at all anymore, because the moment it warned the crystal cities it had stepped outside the column for good. And a courier outside the column is nothing, is a fault, is a thing the lattice would collect the instant it noticed. But Thello had stopped being a piece of the lattice, somewhere back above the blue world, the moment it chose its own eyes over a ruling, and now it followed the 700 ships across the dark, because it had decided, in whatever small free part of itself remained, that it wanted to see the certainty broken. It had served the certainty 9,000 years. It had carried the rulings down to 1,000 worlds and watched 1,000 species lie down inside their measured deaths. It wanted, just once, to watch a species that had refused. Gideon Marsh stayed on the channel the whole crossing. Years of it. The old man did not have years to spare, and Thello came to understand that too, that the shipwright was old in the way that means not many seasons left, and that he had chosen to spend a good portion of what he had left talking to an alien courier across the dark, witnessing his own fleet to the one mind that would carry the witnessing honestly. Marsh talked about the yards. He talked about the people who had built them, the ones who had died building them, falls and decompressions, and the slow grind of 50 years of dangerous work in the dark. He talked about the number, the 900, and how the humans had laughed at it the first time they intercepted it, and then stopped laughing when they understood that the lattice ruled the whole arm with numbers exactly that wrong, that everything the lattice had ever done was built on the same kind of stamp, a measurement made once and never checked, certainty standing in for truth. Marsh said, "That is the thing we are really coming to break, not the structure. The structure is just gray metal around a dead star. We are coming to break the idea that a number you stamped once is the same as a thing that is true, because that idea has killed more species than any weapon ever built. It killed them by telling them they were already dead, and they believed it, and they lay down." He said, "We did not lie down, and when we are done, the next species that hears the lattice tell them they are trapped is going to remember that a people once climbed out of the deepest well in the arm and crossed 4 light years to teach the lattice arithmetic. They are going to remember, and they are not going to lie down either." He said, "That is the real launch. The ships are just how we sign it." Halfway through the crossing, the lattice tried to raise a fleet against the 700, and watching it try was, in its own way, the saddest thing Thello saw in the whole telling. The heart called up the columns to every species it ruled that owned warships, and it issued the rulings it had issued 1,000 times before, the rulings that had always worked, the cold grammar that said, "An obstacle approaches the center, you are ordered to intercept, your future is assessed as victorious, proceed." And for the first time in 9,000 years, the rulings did not work, because the species the lattice ordered to intercept had instruments too, and their instruments saw the same thing Thello saw, 700 human ships crossing the dark with a total mass the lattice had ruled impossible, and the ruled species did the arithmetic the lattice would not, and the arithmetic told them that intercepting the tidewall was not a future assessed as victorious, it was a future assessed as a grave. So they did not go. One by one, the warship species of the lattice received the order to die against the humans, and one by one, for the first time in 9,000 years, they declined. They did not rebel. They were not that brave yet. They simply did not move, and let the ruling sit unobeyed. And an unobeyed ruling is a thing the lattice had never had to handle, because no ruling had ever gone unobeyed, because the certainty had always been believed. The humans, crossing the dark, had already begun to break the machinery before they ever arrived, just by being a thing the machinery could not order anyone to fight. The lattice ruled by showing the weak their deaths, and now, for the first time, it had shown the weak a death they could see was real, the death that waited for anyone who threw themselves at a wall of 700 human mountains, and the weak had looked at that real death and, very quietly, declined to die. The certainty had finally measured something true, and the true thing was the size of the tidewall, and the truth set everyone it touched a little more free. The 700 ships arrived at the dead star, and the heart of the lattice, which had ruled them false for 4 years, finally had to look at them with instruments that could not pretend at point-blank range. And the certainty, which had survived 9,000 years by never being close enough to be proven wrong, was now very close indeed. What the humans did then, Thalo had no word for, and the lattice had no column for, and it has to be described plainly because it was a plain thing done at an impossible scale. The 700 ships arranged themselves around the gray ring of the heart, the 9 great mountains taking the cardinal points, the workhorses filling the spaces, the sleds threading the gaps, until the entire structure of the lattice's heart was held inside a sphere of human mass, exactly as the 11 cities had been held, exactly as patient, exactly as cold. And then, for the first time in the entire telling, the humans lit one gun. A single sled, 40,000 tons, the smallest ship in the fleet, lit a single weapon from its single magazine, and it did not fire it at the heart. It fired it past the heart, out into the dark, at the dead star itself, the cold cinder the lattice had hidden behind for 9,000 years, and the round it fired was not the largest the fleet carried, was in fact among the smallest, and when that single smallest round from the single smallest ship struck the dead star woke up. It did not explode. The humans were more careful than that, and more cruel in the precise way that mercy can be cruel. The round did something to the cinder's cold heart, some deep human trick of physics learned in 40 years of building in the dark, and the dead star, which had been dark for an age, began very slowly to glow. Not brightly, just enough that the gray ring of the lattice's heart, which had hidden in the dark of a dead star for 9,000 years, was suddenly, gently, completely lit. The message could not have been plainer if it had been written across the sky in letters a light year tall. We found your dark. We can light it whenever we choose. The smallest gun on the smallest ship can wake a dead star. Now imagine the 9 mountains. Now imagine all 700. Now imagine what we have been holding back, very patiently, for 40 years, while you ruled us terminal and sold our sun and erased the one honest mind you had for daring to count us right. Thalo understood, watching the cinder slowly brighten, that the humans had chosen the gentlest possible way to make the most terrible possible point. They could have fired on the heart, 700 ships, 9 of them mountains, against a gray ring around a dead star. The structure would have lasted seconds. They could have ended the lattice the way the lattice had ended 1,000 futures, with a number arriving and a thing ceasing to be. But that would have been the lattice's own grammar, death as the argument, and the humans had spent 40 years refusing exactly that grammar. So instead of darkening the heart, they lit the dark around it. Instead of taking a life, they gave a cinder one. They turned a dead star back on, in front of an empire that ruled by death, just to prove that the largest force in the arm could choose to create instead of destroy, and still make its point land harder than any barrage. It was mercy used as a weapon, and it was a more frightening weapon than any gun, because a people who can win and choose not to kill is a people no certainty can ever measure, ever rule, ever push, ever cage. And the heart of the lattice, lit at last, surrounded at last, close enough at last to be proven, did the thing certainty does when it finally cannot restamp the number. It did not bend. It had never learned how to bend. It shattered. Thalo felt it happen across every band at once, 9,000 years of rulings going silent in a single moment, because the heart of the lattice had been one enormous certainty, and a certainty cannot survive being proven wrong about something it had staked everything on. And it had staked everything on the number 900, on the drowning curve, on the law that a thing measured was a thing fixed forever. The humans had just lit a dead star with the smallest gun they owned. 4 light-years from a world the lattice had ruled could not lift 900 tons, and there was no stamp in the universe wide enough to cover that, and the heart, unable to be wrong and unable to be right, simply stopped. Thalo had served the certainty for 9,000 years, and so Thalo, of everything in the dark around that lit cinder, understood best what had just ended. The lattice had not been a fleet, and had not been a structure, not really. The gray ring was only its body. The lattice had been a single idea, the idea that a thing measured was a thing fixed, that the future was a number, and the number could be published, and the published number was the same as truth. That idea had ruled a third of the spiral arm. It had killed more species than any fire, by telling them they were already dead until they believed it, and the belief did the killing. And an idea like that does not die when you break its body. It dies when you break its one necessary promise, which was that the certainty was never wrong, and the humans had just broken that promise in the most public way the arm had ever seen. 4 light-years from a world the lattice had ruled could not lift a coastal boat. By lighting a dead star with the smallest gun on the smallest of 1,000 ships nobody was ever supposed to have. There was no recovering from that. You can rebuild a structure. You cannot rebuild a certainty that everyone has watched be wrong. The promise was the whole empire, and the promise was broken, and so the empire was over. Not in fire, but in the simple, unanswerable fact of a glowing cinder that should not have been glowing. The gray ring did not burn. The humans did not fire a second round. They had made their point with the first, and a people that built 1,000 ships to avoid a war was not going to start one now that it had won without one. The lattice's heart fell silent and dark and lit all at once. Its certainty broken, its rulings ended, and across a third of the spiral arm, on 1,000 worlds, the silence where the rulings used to be began to spread, and on those 1,000 worlds 1,000 species looked up from the futures they had been measured into, and found, for the first time in 9,000 years, that no one was telling them how they would lose. Gideon Marsh, 4 light-years away, very old now, watched the dead star glow on his screen, and let out a breath Thilo could hear across the dark, the breath of a man who has finished a thing he spent 50 years building and was not sure he would live to see done. He said, quietly, "That's it. That's the whole job." He said, "We never wanted the ships. We wanted to be left alone, and they would not leave us alone, so we built the biggest reason in the arm to leave us alone, and then we never used it, for 40 years, because the not using was the point," he said, "and now we have used it exactly once, to wake a dead star and not kill a soul, and that is the only way I ever wanted it used," he said. "That is the difference between us and them, Courier, and it is the only difference that ever mattered. They ruled with the deaths they showed you. We won with the deaths we chose not to cause." The silence after the lattice fell was the loudest thing Thilo had ever heard, because for 9,000 years there had been no silence at all. There had always been the rulings. They came down the columns day and night, on every band, to every world, a constant cold murmur of certainty telling each species what it was and what it would become and how it would end. It was the background of the whole arm. It was the weather of being alive under the lattice. And now it was gone, all at once, 4 light-years from a dead star that a human gun had gently woken, and the goneness of it rang across a third of the spiral arm like a bell that had been struck by the absence of a bell. The 1,000 worlds did not know what to do at first. Thilo watched them through the bands, the worlds the lattice had ruled, and for a while they only waited, the way a jarred thing waits for the next push of the lid, because they had been told their futures for so long that they had forgotten futures could be unwritten. Then, slowly, one world at a time, they began to do the thing the lattice had spent 9,000 years measuring out of them. They began to wonder. A small gray world that had been ruled to die in famine looked at its own fields and found the famine had been a ruling, not a fact, and planted anyway. A water world that had been ruled to never leave its ocean built a raft of metal and floated it on the sky. None of it was large, none of it was a fleet, but all of it was the same thing the humans had done in the dark of the yellow system 40 years before, which was to look at a stamped number and decide, quietly, to find out whether it was true. That, Thalo understood at last, was what the humans had really launched. Not 1,000 ships. 1,000 worlds worth of permission to doubt the number. The ships were just how they delivered it. There was one world, far out near the edge of what the lattice had ruled, that Thilo watched more closely than the rest, because its story was the one that taught the courier what the humans had really done. It was a cold, small world of burrowers, a patient people who lived underground, and the lattice had ruled them terminal 400 years before, ruled that they would never leave their tunnels, ruled that their sky was a lid, and the burrowers had believed it, the way everyone believed the lattice, and for 400 years they had not once looked up. They had a word, in their grammar, that meant both ceiling and forever, the same word, because the lattice had taught them the two things were one. And when the rulings went silent, when the cold murmur stopped, the burrowers came up out of their tunnels for the first time in 4 centuries to find out why the sky had gone quiet, and they looked up, and they saw stars, and they did not have a word for stars, because the lattice had ruled they would never need one. They had to make a new word. The new word they made, when they heard what had happened in the yellow system far away, was the human word, the only one that fit, and it meant the dark you were told was a lid and found was a door. The burrowers carved it over every tunnel mouth on their world, and they have been carving it ever since, and they do not entirely know what it means, only that it came from the people who proved the lid was a door, and that is enough, because a word like that does not need to be understood to be true. That was the launch, not the ships, the word. The humans had launched 1,000 ships, and the ships had broken a structure, but the thing that actually crossed the arm and kept crossing, world after world, century into the future, was the simple proof that a ceiling is only ever a number, and a number can be checked, and the dark over your head was never the cage anyone said it was. The ships were enormous, and the ships were patient, and the ships went home into the dark and slept. The word never slept. The word was the real fleet, and it had 1,000 worlds to reach, and it reached them, one carved tunnel mouth at a time. Thello went home. There was nowhere else to go. The Voron Reach, when the courier returned, had already heard, because the 11 crystal cities had come home with their slow, terrible message. The number was 900, and the number was wrong, and the Reach, which had asked to buy a sun, and been spared by the species that owned it, had gone very quiet, in the way that crystal goes quiet, which is to say, it had stopped growing for a while to think. The Reach did not thank the humans. Crystal does not thank, but it never reached for another sun again, and it told the story, in its slow grammar, to every young crystal it grew after, the story of the day it crept 3 years toward a star it had been told was empty, and found the star defended by a wall of homes that surrounded it, and let it live. The Reach called it, in the end, the mercy in the dark, and it became the oldest story the Reach told, older even than the stories of light. Thello told the truth to the file. There was no file anymore, not really. The lattice that had kept it was silent, but Thello was a creature of the file by 9,000 years of habit, and it could not stop being one, so it wrote the truth down anyway, plainly, for whoever would read it after. It wrote, "The humans were never trapped. We measured the cage and called it the species. We stamped a number 60 years ago and never checked it, and on that single unchecked number we built a ruling that a people were terminal, and we sold their sun, and we erased the one mind among us who tried to count them right, and they answered us not with the slaughter we had earned, but with 11 cities spared and a dead star gently lit, and they ruled us, for 1 hour, the way we should have ruled everyone, which is to say, they showed us our lives and handed them back." Thello wrote, "The column called Ceph was right. The column called Ceph should be remembered." And then Thello, who had no authority to do so, and did it anyway, stamped the name of the dead honest mind into the truth, so that it could not be measured away, the way the lattice measured away everything it found inconvenient. Ceph was right. Let that be true. Down in the yellow system, the tidewall came home. The 300 ships that had stayed to guard the star, and the 700 that had crossed to the heart and back, gathered again in the dark of the great striped giant, where they had been built and hidden, and one by one they banked their long cold drives, and the system went dark again, the way it had been dark for 40 years, 1,000 homes folding back down into the shadow they had risen out of. The humans did not parade the fleet. They did not bring it to Earth to be cheered. They did not paint victory on the hulls. They simply brought the ships home to the dark, the same dark they had been patient in for 40 years, and set them to waiting again, because the not using was still the point, and a tide that has touched the shore once does not stay risen. It goes back out. It waits. It is very, very good at waiting. Gideon Marsh came home too, in his way. The old man had stayed at the deep yards the whole time, the shipwright who does not ride the ships. And when the fleet came back into the dark, he was there to meet it. And Thelo, who had followed everything, watched the last of it from far away through the bands. Marsh walked the great quiet yards where the 9 mountains had been grown, the yards that were empty now because the things they had built had come home and gone back to sleep, and he did the thing a builder does at the end of a long build, which is to walk it once more and touch the things he made. He was very old. He did not have many seasons left, and he knew it, and he had spent the last of his strength on a thing that worked exactly as he had hoped, which is the most any builder can ask. The younger humans, the ones who had ridden the mountains out and back, came to the shipwright when it was done, and they did not know what to say to him, because there is no word for thank you that fits a man who built the reason you never had to die. So they said the small things. They told him the fleet was home. They told him the cities had reached their own region and were growing again. They told him the 1,000 worlds had gone quiet in the good way now, the wondering way, and that on 3 of those worlds, already, someone had built something the lattice would have ruled impossible, and built it anyway, and watched it work. They told him the silence where the rulings used to be was filling up, slowly, with the ordinary noise of species deciding things for themselves. And Gideon Marsh, shipwright of the deep yards, the man who had hidden 1,000 ships in the dark for 40 years, so that no one would ever have to die fighting them, listened to all of it, and then he did the only thing he had ever wanted to do at the end, which was nothing. He went home. There was a small habitat ring around a frozen rock at the edge of the system, one of the very first the humans had built, older than the yards, older than the fleet, and Marsh had a room in it, and a window, and from the window you could see the dark where the ships slept, and Marsh went there and sat down and looked out at the dark he had filled with homes, and rested. He had not retreated, he had not lost. He had built the largest thing in the spiral arm, used it exactly once, to wake a dead star and not kill a soul, and broken the certainty that had ruled 1/3 of the arm for 9,000 years, and now he was an old man in a chair by a window, and he was allowed, at last, to be tired. He stayed on the channel to the courier one final time, because the habit of being witnessed had become a comfort to him, and because he had decided, somewhere in the long crossing, that this alien thing was the right one to leave the last word with. He did not say anything grand. Old men who have finished great work rarely do. He said only what was true. Marsh said, "You came to tell us we were trapped." He said, "I have been thinking about that all this long while, and I want you to take the answer home, because it is the only thing I built that I am sure of." He said, "We were never trapped. Nobody is ever trapped. Trapped is just a number somebody stamped on you and stopped checking." He said, "The whole arm has been lying down inside numbers for 9,000 years, and the numbers were never walls, they were just words, and the only thing it ever took to walk through them was one species stubborn enough to go check." He said, "We checked. That is all we did. We were a small, loud, wet animal at the bottom of the deepest well in the arm, and your empire stamped trapped on us and stopped looking, and we spent 40 years quietly proving the stamp wrong, and when we were done we had 1,000 ships and a freed arm and a dead star we lit, just to make a point." He said, "And the only number that ever mattered, in the end, was the one we never had to use. 40 years of guns, and we fired one round, at a cinder, to wake it up." He said, "You can take that home too. Tell them the humans had 1,000 ships and used one bullet. Tell them that is what strength looks like when it is not afraid." Then Gideon Marsh said the last of it, the part Thelo carried home and kept, the part that became, in the end, the human line the 1,000 freed worlds learned and repeated the way the Reach learned the mercy in the dark. He said, "You thought we were trapped on a rock." He said, "We were never on the rock. We were in the dark all along, building, and the dark was never your cage, it was our workshop." He said, "Go home, courier. Tell your silent empire that the species it measured terminal is the one that taught the whole arm to stop believing the measurement. Tell them we did it without a war. And tell them, if anyone ever stamps trapped on a small, loud people at the bottom of a deep well again, that those people should remember us, and go check the number, because the number is always wrong, and the dark is always a workshop, and nobody, anywhere, is ever as trapped as the ones who stamp them think. And then the old man was quiet, and after a while the channel closed, not in anger and not in death, just closed, the way a man closes a window when the work is done and the night has come and it is finally time to rest. The 1,000 worlds, in the long quiet after, did not become an empire. That was the thing Thalo had half expected and never saw. It had assumed, in its old lattice way, that when one power fell, another would rise to take the columns, that someone would gather up the silent rulings and start publishing endings again, because that was the only shape of power the file had ever held. The humans did not do it. They had 1,000 ships and a freed arm and every right by the lattice's own grammar to inherit the throne of certainty, and they simply did not want it. They sent no rulings. They published no endings. They brought their fleet home into the dark and let it sleep, and they let the 1,000 worlds be exactly as confused and free and unmeasured as the silence had made them. And when a world sent to the yellow system asking what the humans wanted of them now, the humans sent back the only answer they had ever wanted to give anyone, which was nothing, which was you are not trapped, which was go check your own numbers, we are not going to check them for you. That was the whole problem in the first place. Some of the worlds did not know what to do with that. They had been ruled so long that freedom felt like neglect, and a few of them drifted, and a few of them quarreled, and the arm after the lattice was not a tidy place, because nothing true ever is. But none of them lay down again. That was the difference, and it was the only difference the humans had ever wanted to make. The species of the arm had spent 9,000 years lying down inside published endings, and now they stood up, all of them, the clever ones and the foolish ones and the ones who made a mess of their new freedom. They all stood up, because a single small loud people at the bottom of the deepest well had proved, with 1,000 ships and a single bullet fired at a cinder, that the thing keeping everyone on the ground was never gravity and never a fleet and never a wall. It was a number nobody had checked, and once one species checked it, the checking could not be unchecked, and the arm could never be ruled by certainty again, because certainty only works on people who have not yet watched it be wrong, and now everyone had watched. Thalo went home to a silent empire, and a stopped file, and a third of a spiral arm slowly learning to wonder, and it carried the old man's words the way you carry a stone from a place you will never see again, and it told them to everyone who would listen, for the rest of its long catalogued life. The courier never served the lattice again, because there was no lattice to serve, only the silence, where the certainty had been, and into that silence Thalo poured the one true thing it had learned at the bottom of a yellow well, watching a tide of homes rise out of the dark. It told them the number was 900. It told them the number was wrong. It told them an old man built 1,000 ships in the dark so that no one would ever have to fight them, and used one bullet to wake a dead star, and freed an arm without a war, and then went home to a chair by a window to rest, having lost nothing, having retreated from nothing, having simply, patiently, completely won. And on the 1,000 worlds, in the long quiet after, when a young species first looked up at a future someone had stamped on it and felt the old urge to lie down inside it, there was a new thing in the dark to stop them, not a ruling, not a number, a story, passed world to world, in 1,000 grammars, about the deepest well in the arm and the people who turned its dark into a workshop, and built a wall of homes, and proved a stamp wrong, and were never, not for one single day of all those patient years, as trapped as anyone believed. They had thought humanity was trapped on a rock. Then 1,000 ships came up out of the dark, slow and cold and full of mercy, and the whole arm finally looked up and saw that the rock had never been the cage at all. The cage had only ever been the number, and the humans had spent 40 patient years in a workshop made of dark, quietly building the 1,000 reasons no one would ever believe that number again.